This lecture examines the social problems of teen sexuality and pregnancy using the social constructionist approach. Remember, this approach assumes that labeling something a social problem is a product of our society. Often, social issues become labeled as social problems because of moral panics. A moral panic is a severe, often exaggerated social response to a perceived social issue. Great media attention is given to the issue. Public concern with the issue is based on fear and anxiety. Also, the issue is perceived as a threat to the status quo or the current way that society is organized. Teen sexuality is a frequent source of moral panics in our modern society. This is due to the changing organization of gender, romance, and sexuality over time. In the U.S., there was an era known as the sexual revolution in the 1960s and 1970s. During this time, there was a change in social attitudes about sex behavior. More and more individuals began to view sex as a source of personal pleasure rather than just a means of procreation. During that time, sex outside of marriage became increasingly socially acceptable. There was an increase in acceptance of the cohabitation of couples outside of marriage as well. Finally, there was a decline in the sexual double standard, whereby it was socially acceptable for men to have had multiple sexual partners, but not women. It should be noted, this double standard continues to exist today, however not nearly to the degree it did prior to the sexual revolution. For example, of women who entered adulthood in the 1950s who had had sexual encounters, at least 2/3 of them had only one sexual partner, meaning in the 1950s most sexually active young women had not had sex with more than one person in their lifetime. By the 1960s, this number had fallen to below half, meaning most sexually active young women had had sexual relationships with more than one person in their lifetime. Another contributor to changing views about sexuality was the women's movement. Women identified as feminist organized around equal rights for women. This led to changing ideas about women's and men's roles and abilities. This was followed by increasing rates of women's employment in paid labor market. Additionally, there was an increase in access to contraception. Due to the sexual revolution and the women's movement, social meanings that linked dating, sexual activity, marriage, and childbearing began to change. Take a look at this table that compares which traits are desirable in a mate in 1939 to 1996. Though there are some similarities, there have been significant changes over time as well. In 1996, individuals are much more likely to want their mate to be educated, and being in love has become the top priority when selecting a mate. The most relevant change to this discussion is the dramatic decrease in the importance of chastity. Chastity is the act of abstaining from sex outside of marriage, or sometimes sex in general. Whereas this was somewhat of a priority when selecting a mate in 1939, it had dropped almost to the lowest priority by 1996.